All right, here we are again, you gorgeous accursed. Time for Curse of Politics, the weekly political panel show that never fails to put the cuss in disgust. Hey, before I tell you a little bit more about Janet Brown, who's joining Scott, Reid, and I as guest panelists this week, I just want to thank you all for the scintillating Apple podcast reviews we've had lately. Specifically, this one from Nova Scotia Bureaucrat, who says, found this while looking for something similar to the At Issue podcast on CBC, and consider me converted. Hilarious and great commentary on current political events. Swearing is a plus. You hear that, Janet?
I hear it.
And this from PH Dessert, who summed up their thoughts with a simple, I nerd out on it. God damn it, I'm nerding out on that comment, PH Dessert. Scott, you're a nerd. I'm a nerd. We officially got us some nerd company.
Excellent. But wasn't there also a recent one that said something like, I wish Scott Reid would fall off a high place or something? Like there was something, they gave us like a 1. And I just want people to know, like, just don't come and hit 1 star, because the mathematics of this thing are brutal. You know, you take us from a 5 to like a 4.2. And so if you hate me, just send me an email. I'll put them, in the folder. Keep it off the algorithm, please.
The algorithms are relentless and unforgiving. All right, Janet Brown is here. Hi, Janet.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Janet guested with us on the Herle Burley back in February as part of our pollster panel. She's the principal of Janet Brown Opinion Research based in Calgary, and she's been examining and tracking public opinion in Alberta for over 25 years. There's simply no voice I trust or anybody trusts more on what's going on in that province. So today we're going to talk about Minister Guilbeault's plan for oil and gas emissions reduction, or his consultation on it anyway. The UCP leadership race. What's going on in Alberta? Who's going to be the next premier? Patrick Brown is going to be running for mayor of Brampton, because obviously he is. And the Bank of Canada is predicting inflation will top out and start declining by fall. Really? Is this government's plan actually working? And our cursed clipping is Omar Mosley and Alex Ballingall's piece in The Star about fear of violence as a new reality for Canadian politicians, something Scott has faced for many years. And finally, Mr. Pinsent will drop by the show to close with our Hey Yous. Janet, welcome to The Curse. It's great to have you here. How's the weather in Alberta today?
It's nice. We had some rain yesterday, but it's going back to hot. So we had a really hot stampede, and now we're all resting up for Folk Fest, and it looks like we're going to have a hot Folk Fest.
You go to the Stampede?
Well, you can't not go to the Stampede. I mean, I live pretty close to downtown, and I got to the grounds once, but, Stampede is so much more than just, going to the Stampede grounds. So I had kind of a curated Stampede, a lot of coughing and sneezing, and I haven't had COVID yet. So I only went to things that I deemed COVID worthy. So I call it my curated Stampede, and I got to enough stuff, and it's going to be my mantra going forward. Just do the stuff you really want to do at Stampede. Otherwise, it's too exhausting.
What's your favorite rodeo event?
Oh, it's so controversial, but I like the chucks. I like seeing all those horses, and it's exciting. And there's a new event, like First Nations bareback trick riding. That's turned out to be a really great event that's drawn a lot of people in. So
yeah, I think that's one of Scott's favorite websites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I throw a cat for 2 in there, and I'm out of commission for the whole night. I know we talked about the Stampede last week, David, but I forgot to mention. I maybe it won't be of interest to people, but and Janet, you being from Calgary, you may find this of note. I saved Pierre Elliott Trudeau's life at the Calgary Stampede, and I wanted people to know that. I want the Prime Minister to know that, because I feel like maybe some of our commentary here isn't thrilling him, and so I just think, in order to burnish my Trudeau credentials, but it was in the 90 leadership, remember? And we were in Calgary for what seemed like, I don't know, David, what was it, 70, 80 days we were there, in a hopeless first ballot failure that never really had any chance of succeeding, but, the folly of youth. And are on the fairgrounds and on the Stampede grounds there. And suddenly I was just kicking around, and there was this huge storm of people, like just gigantic moving crowd. And, I'm in staffer mode. It's 1990, and I'm like, oh my God. So I assumed that Paul was coming. I assumed that something was up. So I snake my way. And, you got those giant tent pegs, right? Like those giant steel tent pegs that are driven into the ground that, you could impale yourself Dracula-like on, right? And so I crush my way into the middle of this moving blob of people. And suddenly I find myself, like cheek by jowl with Pierre Trudeau. And I realize he's the source of it. So I go into advanced guy mode. I grab him
Suddenly he felt safe.
Suddenly I was like, I've got you, sir. Right? It was very, very superhero-like. And I grabbed him by the back of the belt and just started pulling him and tugging him and directing him so they didn't fall, because he was about 80 or so at the time. Seriously, like he was older and very small. And so I'm grabbing him and I pug him and we get him around the tent poles. And then I turn and Tom Axworthy's standing there. We get him out. The crowd disperses, get him out of there. He doesn't die. Nobody's harmed. I feel, obviously kind of like a first responder. And Tom Axworthy turns to me, first time I ever met Tom, and he turns to me and he says, "Thank you very much. That was that was a big help." And I was aghast, because to me as a staffer, Tom Axworthy was as much of a celebrity as Pierre Trudeau. That's how pathetic my life is, right? Like as a guy who aspired not to be a politician, but someone who worked for politicians, I was dazzled by the sight of Tom Axworthy. So there you have it. I saved Pierre Trudeau and Tom Axworthy's lives.
It's always been a dazzling sight to see Tom Axworthy. Listen, folks, if you like that story, I have a story about how I woke Pierre Trudeau up at 2 o'clock in the morning, but I'll only tell it if you ask nicely, and not today. So, all right. Let's get to some work here. Let's get to some work here, and we're going to start with some serious shit, Janet. Mm-hmm. And that is that Stephen Guilbeault, whose name is a virtual swear word in the province that you come from, yesterday unveiled consultations on the oil and gas sector emissions cap. He did not unveil a cap because it's not hot enough in Europe yet to take immediate action. You just want to be consulting. And he unveiled two ideas. One is a revised version of the existing carbon tax, and the other is a cap and trade type system. Is there any difference between these two things? And how is this all going to go over in Alberta?
Well, this is going to go over like a lead balloon in Alberta. The federal government wants to position this like it's the beginning of consultation, but they've essentially put two offers on the table, right? So you can either have broccoli or Brussels sprouts, and neither one of those are Alberta favorites. So it's really going to go over poorly with the province. We have this leadership race going on right now where the contenders are really focused on things like freedom and autonomy and sovereignty, and the voters have not been there. The voters have been focused on inflation. But when I heard this announcement today, I thought, wow, this is going to give the UCP leadership race new life, because this issue now brings inflation with autonomy together. There's different ways that you can reduce emissions. The pathways to net zero's oil sand group wants to talk about technological solutions, right? Let's reduce emissions by investing in technology, things like carbon capture and storage, try and reduce emissions that way. The other way to reduce emissions is to reduce production. And so this is not going to sit well with Alberta, because this is going to look like the Canadian government thinks the only way to net zero is production reductions. And in this time of inflation and global upheaval, Albertans are going to be really resentful of the fact it looks like the federal government once again is trying to hold back production.
Scott, what was your take on this? How do you think it plays nationally?
Well, I think it's enormously challenging. Like it's become an issue now, particularly because we've moved into this economic crisis of, cost of living increases. Probably interest rates will provoke at least a mild technical recession, if not something worse. And I don't dismiss the possibility that it could be worse. I don't know why we would be sanguine about what that means. And in that context, you say, well, nevertheless, we want to maintain our commitment on these climate change objectives. And the objectives, like through a political lens, you say this is undoable and potentially disastrous. It's undoable because, by 2030, so it's 2022 now, we're 8 years. So let's say you get done all the consultations, the bullshitting around, you finally break the eggs and say, listen, this is what it's going to be. And it's going to be really freaking ugly. So what do you give yourself? Six years to rewire Canadians' behaviors, to rewire industry at a monumental level and reduce things by, 46% or something like that that's just from 2019 level. Like, I mean, it's not possible. But on the other hand, if you take a look around the world, you kind of go, well, like, no one gets credit for fixing 1/4 of the zombie virus problem. And if you believe this is the zombie virus, if you believe that the world is melting and that there's a categorical imperative behind all of this, which is like, if we don't do everything possible, then the world will turn to ash, then you go, well, we have to do it politically. So after all that sermonizing, I end up in this world. I don't think these targets are practical. If you meant it, you would go, you wouldn't consult, because there's no consultation. Like, I mean, who's going to like it, who's not going to like it, and the scars you're going to bear. So if you're saying you're serious about it, then do it. If you're not serious about it, then fuck around. But don't tell me you're serious about it. Bear all the political harm that comes with saying you're serious about it, but actually not move on it. Like, so I think they've got themselves in close to the worst of all possible worlds, where they're going to bear all the political brunt, but possibly not get credit for action. And the final thing I have to say is a question to Janet: which plays less?
It's already how this podcast works, by the way.
David. I think. Why don't you go have a cigarette? I've got a lot of things to ask Janet. Very intelligent, probing questions. Does it matter? Like, let's just take Guilbeault's two options. So, Janet, my question to you is, do Albertans freak out at cap and trade because they say that option overwhelmingly punishes our industry as compared to others, and therefore you're going against our home court? Or do they object most to carbon tax because people are so tax sensitive and they say that's essentially going to be picking my pocket at a time when cost of living is spiraling out? Like, which of these is more manageable? I always prefer the cap and trade mechanism for a variety of reasons, but I'm wondering, which one do you think is more politically unpalatable?
It's broccoli and Brussels sprouts. I mean, they're both unpalatable to people. And if you're going to force me to make a decision, I think probably,
and no bacon with the Brussels sprouts, right?
No,
like, just pure up Brussels sprouts.
No maple syrup. I mean, you can't even salt them up. They're just. These are not choices that it's not that one is better than the other. I mean, if you force me to make a choice, I'd say probably cap and trade, because that's really where that's where Alberta sort of was prior. I mean, the idea of a carbon tax, particularly a economy-wide carbon tax, that is just an absolute electric rail here in Alberta. But really the issue is, you talked about it, Scott. How realistic is this? If you're going to set goals that aren't realistic, then what's the point? I think what frustrates a lot of Albertans is Alberta's seen as very single-minded on this one. We don't care about the economy. We don't want to get to net zero. These things aren't important. And I think that's just misunderstanding Alberta public opinion. Most people in Alberta think that climate change is anthropological. I can't say that word, but it's caused by human activity. Most people know that,
but not theirs.
Not
but not theirs.
You're anthropological.
When there's something that impacts Canadians economically, socially, environmentally, frankly, in just about every aspect of our lives, you tend to want to come back to that subject again and again. So yes, Hurly-Burleyites, we are embarking on a multi-week discussion of the importance of spectrum and spectrum policy in this country, of our presenting sponsor, TELUS. And even as this is a TELUS message, it's with the backdrop that millions of Canadians have, in the last 2 weeks, had a deeply felt reminder of just how critical it is to have best policy in the digital space. Let's take a step back for a second. We've talked before here about how spectrum are the radio frequencies upon which wireless data travels. Spectrum is what makes your smart devices, well, smart. And it's fundamental to how all of us thrive in urban centers and rural and Indigenous communities all across the country. So, fair warning. In the coming weeks, we're going to take a deep dive into how the entire spectrum ecosystem works in Canada. In doing that, we'll bring it all down to a micro level and tell some compelling stories about how these invisible waves can, with excellent policy, have even greater effect on our lives economically, socially, and environmentally. We'll also bring it back up to a macro perspective and look at what our international competitors are doing with their spectrum policy, so we can compare some best practices in other countries. The digital landscape is an ever-evolving picture, Hurly-Burlyites. What went yesterday doesn't necessarily have a bearing on what's going to bring the greatest benefit to Canadians from here on out. And that, in a nutshell, is why this is such an important story to tell. Learning and innovation in technology and policy can bring change for the better. Chapter 2 comes next week. Janet, help me. Okay, because I really do want to understand this. So, politics and the reality are so out of whack on this issue. So we literally are in a week where the planes can't land at Heathrow in London because the runway's melting. People can't drive in France because the roads are melting. And I suspect that the wine produced in Spain and Portugal this year is going to have an interesting flavor to it. So all that's going on this week, and we're having this debate in Canada this week. Do Albertans really think it's possible that we're never going to restrict the amount of oil produced? Is that the expectation?
No, I don't think it is at all. I think Albertans know that that's where we need to go. I think Albertans think in the long run that you're reducing carbon emissions in the oil sands, moving to more renewable energy, like in the very long play, that's a good strategy for Alberta. I think what Albertans argue about is more the timing. Like, yeah, the runways are melting at Heathrow, but people are still on planes. Planes are still taking off and landing, right? So, you can restrict production in the oil sands, but that's not going to mean that planes aren't going to, take off and land from Heathrow. And the question for most Albertans is, where is that oil and gas going to come from? Because just because you shut the oil sands down doesn't mean that there's not going to still be a lot of demand in the very places in Europe that are suffering so much for the heat. Where there is air conditioning, it's cranked up, and these are all really hard choices. And Alberta gets that. We're not denying that, or on balance, of course, there's a variety of opinion here, but, on balance, Albertans aren't denying that this is a direction we need to take. But, if you set the goalpost at 2030 and you just have no chance of reaching it, Albertans would rather talk about a different timeline, right?
Listen, they're no different than they're no different than me, right? I'm not making any sacrifice for climate. There's nothing in my life that you can point to where I have made a sacrifice in my standard of living to save the climate. I just sit here and preach and run my mouth about it all the time. And Albertans aren't prepared to make any sacrifice either. And you know what? Quebecers who say that they're the most aggressive people, they're not prepared to make any sacrifices for this either. Nobody is prepared to make any sacrifices for this. So how does it end?
Well, exactly. And so you can reduce emissions in the oil sands, you can reduce production. But if that doesn't reduce demand, if the demand is going to be filled from somewhere else, that's the frustration for Alberta. If we're going to get off of oil and gas, that's one thing. But it seems like the federal government just wants the world to get off of Canadian oil and gas. And,
it's not fair, though. Is it? You got to start a journey with one step, right? I mean, look, I'm like David, so I'm not trying to sermonize here in the sense that I don't make any of the sacrifices that no one that those who are committed to this issue make. So I don't come at it from a position of moral superiority, just the opposite. But if you believe this is an existential threat, then you do what you can within your control. And if you say, well, I won't do anything until someone makes India and China change their conduct, well, then that's just a recipe for paralysis. And so there's a collision between an existential threat and a political threat. Governments have to manage both, and they end up in the world where they're not. They're satisfying neither audience or satisfying neither goal.
That's a stereotype, and that's the corner Alberta always gets backed into, right? Well, you guys don't want to do anything. Well, no, I think that Alberta's trying to say, look, we do have a record when it comes to reducing emissions. We do have a record when it comes to environmental stuff. But Alberta wants to talk about a realistic timeline, a realistic goal for getting there. If you put a cap and trade system in, if you put carbon taxes on, you could be reducing investment in the sector. And if you reduce investment, you could be reducing the opportunity to find some good technological solutions. So, we always get back into this corner of we don't care about the environment. And of course we care about the environment. If you've been here and you see the natural environment we all live in, of course we care about it. Albertans do a lot of things for the environment. We've got huge recycling rates and things like that. But yeah, we still, Albertans still drive their big trucks just like other Canadians do as well. So,
but wait a second.
To say that Albertans don't want to do anything is a really bad stereotype.
So you're a pollster. You can tell us. You're a pollster. You can tell us what Albertans think. Mm-hmm. But you can't blame us for having a different point of view, because since Rachel Notley left office, I haven't heard a political leader from the Alberta government talk about climate change that made me think they cared about it one tiny whit. I've not heard any messaging from the Alberta government that made me think that Alberta cared about climate change one tiny bit. So maybe the voters do, but the messaging from the government's awful.
I cannot blame you one iota. And you'll remember, David, back in December, I did a whole bunch of research on Alberta's reputation outside of Canada. And you and I talked about it on the West of Centre podcast. And Jason Kenney's head exploded. And I just kind of did this research kind of innocently, thinking that Alberta really did have to think about its reputation outside of the province. And I thought it was a pretty innocuous piece of research. And Jason Kenney stood up in front of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce and called my work un-Albertan. So, absolutely, I get it. And I've been in the crossfires of trying to sort of talk in a different way. But, you're absolutely right. And now we've had this government that's been very intransigent where the federal government's concerned. And now we're in the middle of this UCP leadership race where it's exactly the same thing.
Bad to worse.
Freedom. It's bad to worse is how how it feels for a lot of Albertans, for sure.
It's hopeless. It's hopeless. I mean, honest to Pete, it's hopeless. Like the action that's required, I know it's easy to say, well, people care. People in Alberta care. People across Canada care. People around the world
throws in
care.
an honest to Pete just for his mom once in a while.
But seriously, everybody cares to the point where, but unless they're forced to suffer a cost or a consequence. And, we could say, well, I'm for a different timeline. That's just for saying I'm for not actually dealing with it. And again, I'm not sermonizing because I'm included in the group of people that thinks it's a problem, but I'm really not willing to get off my ass and do something about it because that would require sacrifice. And there's always going to be, because of the time frames involved, it's always going to seem like there's something more urgent. Politically, there will always be something more urgent. There will be a war somewhere, an economic crisis. And all of these things, add up to the action that would be proposed will be inadequate. The political backlash will be severe. The middle road, if it's successfully taken, will not do enough. And, eventually what happens is we'll all just eat ash for breakfast and dinner. And that's where this thing is going, unless we find a technology that not only fixes climate, but that it actually allows us to decarbonize, but allows us to reverse the damage done already. Isn't it? Let's just summarize it by saying it's hopeless. It's not going to be solved because human behavior doesn't want to solve it.
No, it's going to be solved. It's going to be solved by the amazing next premier of Alberta. Who's going to be who, Janet? Who's going to be who? Why can't Alberta get past this Brian Jean Danielle Smith thing? My God, these are the two most unimpressive people I could observe. And here they are. They won't leave. Every electoral cycle, they're hanging around as the potential next premier. Christ.
Well, and the reason we're talking about these two unimpressive candidates is because the other candidates are even more unimpressive and more boring. So, who's going to win?
Who's going to win?
People keep asking me that, and I have literally been contacted by everybody and their uncle to poll on this. But here's the problem as a pollster. I poll the general public. And this leadership race is going to be about party members. So even if they get a huge turnout, we're probably talking about maybe 1-2% of the voting public participating in this thing. So I can do a poll, but all a poll is going to get at is name recognition. And whether you like them or not, Danielle Smith and Brian Jean have the best name recognition. So any poll that gets done is going to show them in the lead. What we don't know is if there's any of these other candidates who are sort of quietly building up enough of an arsenal. It doesn't look like it, but so Danielle Smith, I mean, she is packing halls. She's seems to be getting a lot of excitement around her campaign. To the 98% of Albertans that aren't going to participate in this leadership review, it's going to kind of be confusing to them. But, she just has to capture maybe 1% of the electorate, and she's the next premier of the province.
Unless, of course, Rachel Notley were to offer her a cabinet post, in which case she would dissolve her party and switch to the NDP. Like, what the fuck? Anyway.
Well, no, hang on. Can we ask about that? Because seriously, here's something I don't understand. And I'm coming at it from so far away. And I'm a dirty Central Canadian. I understand all those things. I'm an asshole Ontarian. Mm-hmm. But I know political parties. And I can't for the life of me understand, even though it was a few years have passed, how it is that within the culture of a political party, and what was Wild Rose is heavily folded into what is now UCP, those people watched her sell them down the river. Just shove it right up their ass. How can those people now turn around and say, and she therefore is our top choice? I mean, political tribalism suggests that trust is a critical factor, and I don't get why these people are is she selling new memberships that are drawing people in? Is it I don't understand. Why wouldn't those people that lived through this past decade with her say, sorry, you've actually shown us what you're about, and you're about you, not us. Piss on you.
Yeah. So it was 2014, right? So it's about 7.5 years ago that this happened. And I've lived through a lot of turmoil in Alberta politics, but I remember that day I was absolutely gobsmacked. And I was doing an interview with the QR77, the news radio station here. And I was on my cell phone and the line dropped while I was in the middle of the interview. And, I'm not the pushiest commentator, but I called the control room, get me back on. I have more to say. I was just, and all the talking heads in Alberta, we were just constantly, contacting each other. We could not believe when this happened. We could not believe that her political instincts failed her so miserably that she thought the population would be happy when the leader of the opposition just folded into the governing party. And
who obviously really had his finger on the pulse of what the Wild Rose voter was thinking.
Right. And honestly, I and so many of my friends believed that was something you could never, ever, ever come back from. And even a few weeks ago, I thought, okay, she'll draw big crowds. She's a good talker. People will want to sort of hear from her. But ultimately people won't vote for her. So maybe she'll sell them a membership and they'll go vote for Brian Jean or something. But she has apologized so profusely for that so many times. And she starts almost every one of her rallies with essentially a full-throated apology, total contrition. And I actually think she's probably to the point now where she has apologized enough. And it's shocking me to see it, but it looks like there's a certain segment of the Alberta population who are madder at Trudeau and madder at Ottawa and feel like she's crawled across enough glass. And as I said, if 2% of the population votes in this leadership, she only has to win over 1% of the population. And her apology has been enough for that 1%. So she's not going to lose this because of the floor crossing.
Amazing.
It's like profile and familiarity, right? If you watch Bruce Willis in Armageddon enough times, rewatch it on, cable channels over and over and over again, you start to think to yourself, well, maybe it is a good idea to send some oil men up to an asteroid and blow it up. Maybe that would work. And I guess just listen to her on the radio, watch her on TV for 8 years, people are like, well, maybe it is a good idea to make her premier. But when you talk about the things people care about, even if you don't have the right solutions, right? I mean, you look at Donald Trump, right? Didn't he do enough to disqualify himself from being president of the United States? Did he really have the right kind of solutions for the United States when they elected him? No, but he was talking about the issues that a certain group of the population felt weren't being addressed. And that's what Danielle Smith's doing. She's appealing to this particular part of the population that didn't feel their issues are being addressed any other way. Are her solutions sort of practical? Are they really going to help Alberta? Are they really going to help with investment in Alberta? Probably not. But there's a whole bunch of people who feel that nobody was paying attention to them, over the last few years, and they're going to forgive her that mistake she made in 2018 because she's saying the right things to them
or the mistake she made in 2014, they're going to forgive her for that because of the things she's saying in 2022.
So it sort of feels like everything is falling apart, doesn't it? Labor and material shortages are wrecking our whole idea of normal. Airports are understaffed and clogged. The government has just ordered mobile chairs so people in line at passport offices can sit. Hospitals are understaffed and jammed. International supply lines are stretched and sclerotic. And thanks to Russian aggression, the world's food supply is severely disrupted. Well, our sponsor, CN, is doing its bit for the normal we all want to see return. The railway is now current on its grain shipments and has been since spring. That's industry talk for on schedule, no backlogs. And to ensure cargo keeps moving smoothly as we head into fall and winter, CN is spending some serious money. In Alberta, $365 million. That means installing tens of thousands of new railway ties and miles of new track, replacing 56 road crossings, and upgrading bridges, culverts, signal systems, and other infrastructure that ensures trains run on time. In Manitoba, the same sort of work to the tune of $160 million. In Saskatchewan, $185 million. CN will be replacing 151,000 railroad ties in my home province, incidentally. That's a whole lot of logs. And in BC, $390 million. Same deal. Further, CN is extending sidings between Winnipeg and Edmonton, starting similar projects at the ports of Prince Rupert and Vancouver, and double-tracking key sections of its western network. In plain English, that means giving one train a place to park and make way for a train coming in the opposite direction. In even plainer English, CN is making maximum effort to ensure cargo moves safely and on schedule. Obviously, weather is a big factor, and last year was brutal. But CN is determined that those things within its control are copacetic. That's a promise. Okay, so you can't tell us who's going to win the leadership because you don't poll the membership of the Conservative Party, United Conservative Party, and I understand you on that. But now I'm going to put you on the spot on something you are an expert in. Which one? Let's say there's three leading candidates: Smith, Jean, and Taves. Is that right? Do you think?
I would say that's right. Yeah, there's a few other candidates. Yeah, there's other candidates, but
which one of those three is most likely to lose to Rachel Notley?
Probably Danielle Smith, but most likely doesn't mean definitely. Doesn't mean certain. Right. Will certainly lose to her. Right. So it's been hard to poll right now because when you ask people, who would you vote for if election were held today, that's a hypothetical question at the best of times, and it's even more hypothetical when the governing party doesn't have a permanent leader. So what I've been doing instead is I've been asking about available vote, just who's on your consideration list. And with the inevitable resignation of Jason Kenney, a lot more Albertans have put the UCP on their consideration list, even though it seems like there are some extreme candidates. So, Rachel Notley, she the people around her might have did a little happy dance when Jason Kenney got 51.4% in the leadership, but they really needed to be careful what they asked for because there's new issues of concern to Albertans right now, and an NDP victory almost looked like a certainty a year ago. It doesn't look like a certainty anymore.
Well, Jason Kenney may look on the national stage like Peter Dinklage, but I think that he is relative to those people remains a political giant. I would way rather be running against any of those people than against Jason Kenney myself. But
Jason Kenney's supporters, like through the whole leadership review process, they were saying, hey, we got to stick with Jason. There's nobody else. And then lo and behold, that turns out it was a pretty good argument because
there's nobody else.
because Jason Kenney is kind of looking pretty good in comparison. So it'll be interesting to see when this leadership race is fully done, whether Albertans in general have a little bit of remorse for the loss of Jason Kenney.
So, hey, Janet, we have a section of this show called Clippings where we take a clipping from the news and we talk about it. So here's what we're going to do. Scott, we're going to lead off with Scott on this because he is very excited about this, chose this clipping. It comes from the Toronto Star. and it is called Fear, Loathing, and Anti-Politics, Inside the New Reality for Canadian Politicians. It starts with an anecdote about a Liberal MP named Judy Sgro being stalked. And it says here that in an increasing sign of increasing worries since the 2021 election, the all-party governing body for the House of Commons has moved to provide MPs with mobile panic buttons that trigger emergency alerts, to conduct security checks at politicians' homes, and to kick off a pilot project to provide security for MPs in events and duties outside the parliamentary precinct. So the gist of the article is that things have gone from angry people calling open line shows to a much, much greater level of threat where people are actually physically threatening politicians in Canada. Goes back to what Michael Wernick said a couple of years ago at committee about what they were seeing, and he was roundly dismissed probably because it was seen as a deflective tactic, not so much the substance of what he was saying. Scott, what do you make of this? I mean, politicians get threats. It's not unheard of. It used to be unusual, but it's not unheard of. Is it worse?
Not unheard of, but definitely unusual, certainly atypical, and serious threats where you have to contemplate shutting down an event, which the Prime Minister had to do last week because you're afraid of when the PMPD, the Prime Minister's personal details, says, sir, we're not going to permit you to do this. Like when they turn to the political level and they go, we're not doing it. Okay? Like, I don't want to hear you read. I don't want to hear the advance team. Shut the fuck up. Our job is to secure the personal well-being of the Prime Minister, and we can't do it in this event. We simply can't be satisfied. That happened once when Paul was Prime Minister. I remember where you would have these threats occasionally. They'd usually be vague, and nothing that you wouldn't proceed, nothing that would cause you to not proceed with the event. Once, I can recall once there was an event where they were genuinely scared. There was a specific threat, could potentially be in the room. But, the reason I asked to talk about this is we talked about it on the radio here. I do a lot of radio with News Talk 1010 and the Bell Media Radio Network. And I was quite taken aback at the reaction of other people I was talking with on the radio and the reaction of the call-in public. And yes, it's talk radio. But the reaction was dismissive, derisive. Oh, for Christ's sake, these whining politicians, suck it up, buttercup, all this kind of John Wayne macho horseshit, right? Like, hey, these guys are, pearl clutching and all this stuff. And I just want to say, like, I think that we've watched something happen steadily over the past decade where, we've watched, the combination of social media, the galvanizing effect it has, the sense of community it creates, the ability to talk and wind one another up, organize, and then actually mobilize. We've watched all those things latch themselves onto political movements because political leaders say, hey, I see a standing army of people who don't normally vote, who might be persuaded to vote, who could therefore provide me with support. And so they don't lead that parade. They follow that parade and then try to hustle every once in a while in front of it and say what the parade is saying. And we've seen the deleterious effects of that. And we're watching it in the Pierre Poilievre campaign most specifically, but also in campaigns and in the flavor and tone of people like Danielle Smith. Everyone will say, I reject violence. I reject, white supremacists and all these extremists. I reject any act of violence. But the rhetoric and the association fuels and endorses and validates these guys. And they're mostly guys, by the way, fucked up guys, incels and that sort of stuff. And when you get that, I don't think that you can dismiss the possibility that this doesn't mushroom into behavior that goes from threatening to potentially dangerous. And so do I think everybody's confronted with this constantly? Am I predicting disaster? No, but we're on a moving sidewalk towards something worse rather than something better. And there are politicians who are adding kindling to this fire knowingly. And they're going to try to distance themselves from some sort of terrible event somewhere down the road. And they ought not to be allowed to do that because they're feeding this. They're breathing oxygen onto this, onto this spark, which could turn into something more serious.
Janet, what's the dynamic behind this?
Oh, that's, I don't even know that I'm qualified to answer that question. It's so many things, like Scott said, right? Like it was always there. There was always crazy people there. We've had horrible things happen to politicians throughout history. But we have this kind of new fuel for the fire, in that social media. And somebody who's unbalanced can just, Google things and find things and fuel what makes them unbalanced. So it's very scary, and it's driving good people away from politics. Particularly, it's driving good women away from politics. And a lot of people just dismiss it and say, like, oh, politics, you get lots of perks. You've got security. What do you want me to do, right? Like, I'm just stating my opinion. I'm not fueling anything here. So, I just think the bigger concern is we're talking about the UCP leadership race, and I have so many friends that are telling me that they're, discouraged by the choices that they have, and it's like, well, are you participating? Why didn't you put your name forward? It's really the add-on effect for all of us is the right people aren't going into politics, and we don't have the right choices on the ballot when we go to vote.
That is such an important point about this. If you're wondering why our choices for political leadership are so thin, this is a big part of the answer to that. Who would go into this? Who would expose your family to this? Who would put your children at risk of what might happen? It's getting bizarre, and it is affecting our political choices. I don't think there's any doubt about that. In fact, almost all the people who run now for political leadership are people who've been in politics their entire lives. That's all they know. Because people who are outside of politics and watch it aren't attracted to get into it.
Oh, absolutely. And there's so many things about the political process, how we choose our candidates. It's making somebody go around and getting a whole bunch of nomination forms signed and door knocking and things like that. The things you have to do to win a nomination and win an election, those are skills that are not very important when it comes to being a legislator, right? So we put people through this test that's not even a very good test of their abilities, right? It's like making an Olympic diver qualify for the Olympics by doing a synchronized swimming routine, right? So we put politicians to the test, and we don't put them to the right test. And I can do a 6-minute video and walk and talk and hit a pickup truck on cue. Is that really what we need from a politician? It's sure what we need from somebody starring in a truck commercial, but is it really what we need from a prime minister?
1 5-minute video at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of, an oblique reference to the federal leadership race takes us to Patrick Brown. My God, what a surprise it was yesterday when he announced he was running for the mayor of Brampton. I had no idea that was going to happen. From the whole time this race was going, it never occurred to me that he was going to turn around and run to be mayor of Brampton. I said on Twitter yesterday, why isn't this guy more angry about what's happened to him? Why isn't this guy more vigorously out there attacking the party that has completely defamed him? Completely. If they've not defamed him if he's guilty, but if he isn't guilty, they've completely defamed him. They've taken a guy who was a provincial disgrace and they've made him a national disgrace. And he kind of seems okay with it. Well, I guess them's the breaks. I'll go run for mayor of Brampton. It's curious behavior, Scott, isn't it?
Yeah, you'd think, like Dr. Kildare, if you'd been accused of a heinous crime, you think you would spend the rest of your life trying to find the one-armed man. But he doesn't seem to care about the one-armed man. Makes you wonder if maybe that man has 2 arms and is doing something wrong with them. It's a really good question, and it highlights to me the absurdity of Patrick Brown, David. And, look, here are some facts. The guy was drummed out of Queen's Park amid a swirl of unpleasant allegations of all sorts. And that included 4 confirmed violations of ethics. He's been now drummed out of the federal conservative race amid a series and swirl of allegations. Which he contests but doesn't appear to be contradicting in any substantive way. And even in Brampton, where he's running, he now faces 5 councillors, 2 of which are deputy mayors, allegations of financial impropriety and irregularities. So where this guy goes, allegations follow. Federal, provincial, and local. He's the trifecta, man. He's the hat trick. He's the hat trick of shit. And so, the sad thing is, that you would hope that Brampton would say, look, every time you get kicked out of something you want badly, you turn to us, right? We're Betty Cooper when you can't get time with Veronica Lodge, and we're not going to go for it again. But the reality is that, local politics, name recognition and organization in a race where 25 to 30% of people vote are probably going to secure you victory, and he'll probably be secured victory. And we're going to be stuck with this stain in public office yet again. And whatever. But, he's just like, oh, well, all those allegations that I was tearfully denying, well, they're behind me now. We'll just leave them unexplored. I mean, I wouldn't let that stand if it was against my name and I was innocent. I would Dr. Kildare that thing until I found the one-armed man, but not him.
Hey, Charest wants another debate.
Oh, for Christ's sake.
Charest wants another debate in the Conservative leadership. It reminds me of in 1989 when Turner resigned and the Martin people were pushing for a more than a year-long leadership race. And Chrétien said, it's like the Maple Leafs asking to wait for the playoffs until they're ready to play. And so, I mean, one more debate. Like if I was at a meeting and somebody said, should we extend the debate? I would say, no, I call the question. Like, let's just have the vote because this thing is so over, right? Janet?
Well, the membership sales are done, and it seems like it's hard to imagine any scenario where Poilievre doesn't win, right? So, but Charest is still in there fighting, and the only reason we're even talking about Charest is because of the point system. And I do math every day, but I'm not quite good enough to figure out how the point system is going to increase this stuff. The other thing for Charest is with the loss of Patrick Brown in the race, there's a whole bunch of votes there up for grabs, right? Do those people sort of say like, oh, okay, well, I can't vote for Patrick Brown, I'll vote for Charest, or do they just not fill in their ballot at all? So there was a calculation, I think, for Charest that he needed a bunch of Patrick Brown's second place votes. He hasn't gotten a lot of splash. He was out here in Calgary. The only thing that got covered while he was out here in Calgary was the fact that he didn't get involved in cowboy cosplay and he didn't dress up. And so he didn't even get any positive media there. I can see why he's fighting for a debate, but at the same time, this thing seems to be over. And since there's no membership sales on the table, it's hard to imagine that this thing isn't baked in already.
Scott, what do you think of the video, the latest Poilievre video? The house. I come from where you come from. I don't want to talk about reclaimed wood. It's a dark video and I don't like it. But right. But the I come from where you come from. I was watching that and I was wondering how many people actually even identify with that video anymore.
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, to me, so first of all, it's well done and well executed. Again, and Janet mentioned this, and to be fair, ability to perform and perform with skill is a critical mandatory requirement of somebody who's going to be a good, strong political leader, right? FDR, turned a nation around largely on the basis of performative skill from a wheelchair through radio waves. So, it's impressive and important, and he knows how to do it. And I think what's really impressive is not designed for him. He's not a vessel.
Maybe the first recorded Poilievre FDR comparison on record. I'd like to make note of that.
I'm proud to be its author. But it's impressive. He drives it personally. He writes a lot of this stuff, and he designs and drives it. And and I think that's for good and for worse. So what's good is you see something that's a very compelling, very pointed, very retail message. What's I think maybe not to his advantage is he does not always recognize the narrowness of the message. And I think what you say, I mean, there's an old stock, an implicit old stock message there. And listen, you talk about, the reclaimed wood, there's an old stock implicit message there, right? And he's, it's touching a certain nerve, but it also touches off, alarms for lots of people. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, it really is a signal to people saying, if you don't if you don't like, not only are we not progressive conservatives, but if you don't like the tone of progress, if you don't like the tenor of progress, if you don't like where progress has taken us for the last 20, 30, 40 years in terms of society and where it's left you as compared to where you thought you were, the house you're in as compared to the house you wanted to be in or grew up in, then I'm your guy. And, I don't know how, yes, there's political strategy, but I think there's a lot of personal psychology. I think there's a lot of Pierre Poilievre in that. And so, I think it's fascinating. But I think there are threads in there that could be his undoing. And it just takes me back to, I don't know why the Conservatives haven't put a middle linebacker on this guy to make him pay the consequences, to highlight and
the Liberals, you mean?
Those issues. What did I say? Pardon me. I meant the Liberals. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Maybe I heard something different.
Well, I'm starting to lose my dementia settling in. I mean, I'm old wood.
Janet, is he trying to tap into something really deep and maybe a little dark with this? What Scott said is old stock messaging.
So this is the challenge for both federal conservatives and provincial conservatives here in Alberta, is the people that are coming out to play, the people that are getting involved in these leadership races are not a subset of, are not a random representative subset of the population. It is the people who are feeling very disconnected, very nihilistic, very worried about the future, feeling like they're left behind, status loss. All those things we talked about on the Herle Burley podcast 6 months ago, or however long it was. So this is the problem for the Conservatives, is those are the people who are playing in their leadership races. Those are the people that they are trying to appeal to. But then you go to a general election and the messages that got you elected leader are going to be problematic for you in a general election. And so it's what happened to Aaron O'Toole. And it's hard to imagine Poilievre being able to make that transition that's going to make him play in a place like Brampton. And the same, if Danielle Smith is the next leader of the UCP, it's going to be difficult for her to transition away from her, ivermectin messages that she's been promoting for the last 2 years.
I find that there's got to be a huge gap in the political sphere right now, you guys, because the Conservatives have a message for me that says Canada was better 30 years ago than it is today.
Yeah.
And the Liberals have a message that says Canada was never any good and needs to change a lot to be a good place. What about the people who love Canada? What about the people who think Canada's a great place? That used to be the best political zone. The Liberal Party owned patriotism, owned identification with Canada, one of its greatest brand strengths. Why isn't anybody standing up and appealing to the people who think Canada, some warts and sure, but pretty great place? Where's that in our politics?
It's such an interesting insight, eh? Because it's sort of like Trudeau, for valid individual specific reasons, seems to do an apology every 4 weeks, right? So, but as you say, I mean, the cumulative impact, whether you think they're substantive or superficial or whatever, set that debate aside, right? There is an implied communication of, there's a lot to be ashamed about. And maybe that's true. And I'm a 50-year-old white guy, so I say this tentatively. But that's the cumulative impact, right? As you say, which is that, there's, so I want to apologize about the past. And Pierre Poilievre is saying, I want to protest the moment. And those things are so far apart. And I think there's lots in each message that make large chunks of the population uncomfortable.
Yeah. I recently asked.
It's going to dictate our politics the next.
Yeah, I recently asked a question that I released at an event, Alberta Relaunch, that I participated in a couple of weeks ago, and we asked people to put themselves on a left-right political continuum. And this is here in Alberta, right? So you can only imagine what these numbers look like across Canada. But the most common answer people give on a scale from 0 to 10 is they call themselves a 5. And like 60% of the population is bunched into the middle of the scale. And this is Alberta, right? So whenever I show the graph that accompanies that data, I always say, Alberta is not a right-wing province. It's a centrist province that just leans to the right. And so what's happened here in Alberta is we went for a long time just having a one-party political system. Now we've effectively moved into a two-party political system. But really, it's a multi-party electorate. And so there's this huge part of the population who's not participating. I changed the way I measure voting intention a while ago, and I keep track of this group I call the orphans. And these are people who are committed to voting. They're not undecided in that they're checked out of politics like some undecided voters are. They want to vote, but they tell me here in Alberta, neither the UCP nor the NDP works for them. They're hoping a third party will emerge, but they don't know that third party. So this is like a big professional preoccupation for me right now. Are these orphans, which here in Alberta, I estimate to be within 15 and 20% of the population. And we're focused on the extremes, but this next election here in Alberta is going to be about the people who are currently orphaned, and in particularly the people who are orphaned here in Calgary.
All right. Well, we will check back with you to find out how the orphans are doing and which parent they want to adopt. It's time for Gordon Pinsent and the Hey Yous to wrap up our show. No inflation today, by the way. I think it's sticking around. We'll get to it next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right, Scott, show us how it's done with a Hey You.
Oh, I don't know, but I'm going to show it how it's done. I'm going to reprise something I said already, but I have a very short Hey Yous to the people of Brampton. Please do me a solid. Would you show some self-respect? Don't let this guy treat you like a doormat, right? In October, tell Patrick Bound to take a flying fuck. And just, don't re-elect the guy. Don't. That's my Hey You.
All right, Janet.
2 Patrick Brown Hey Yous in a row. I'm pathetic.
I know. And you stole mine. Janet, before you give us your Hey You, tell us about your shirt.
Well, my shirt, yeah. I wore this shirt contemplating my Hey You.
What are we supposed to give, by the way? Give a what?
So it says give a damn.
Give a damn.
Let's not get blue here, okay?
So my Hey You is to centrists. Like, hey you, if you guys sit on the sidelines, this thing is going to get carried away without you. You need to give one of these. Plug for my friend. I know Mike McDonald wore a shirt from Madam Premier on the Herle Burley last week. Madam Premier's in my neighborhood. I thought I got to get over there and get a T-shirt with a statement on it. So I got this "Give a Damn" T-shirt. It also feels it serves another purpose. Many of my friends did not think that it made sense that I was being invited to the Curse of Politics because I so very rarely curse. So Janet, damn it, Janet, she's saying give a damn. Hey you, centrists. You're going to be lost in this thing if you sit in the sidelines.
Damn it, Janet gives me PTSD, Oh, man.
Yeah.
To be fair, Madam Premier did.
Jesus Christ. All right.
Madam Premier sent, she's terrific, sent me a shirt too, David, for the pod, for the Ontario election, but I got it after the election was over, so I still haven't worn it. So I feel great shame, and I don't want her to feel like we've been ignoring her. But so I gotta get me something fresh. I did order a couple cool books off her website for my kids, which is pretty fun.
All your political wares here in downtown Calgary.
All right, my Hey You goes out to Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson. Clean up in aisle 5. Get over to Alberta as quickly as you can and start talking to the people about this and what we're going to do and how they're part of the solution. I think we need a slightly different spokesperson in Alberta than we've got. You're the guy. Do it. All right, everybody. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS. I'd like to thank our sponsor, CN Rail. I would like to thank Janet Brown and Scott Reid for joining me today. Thank you very much. And all of you for listening or watching. We'll be back next week with more Curse of Politics and maybe more cursing.